Storm over Kaunas. Kaunas, Lithuania. July 26, 1940. The air vibrated with tense expectation. The world teetered on the edge of disaster. The German juggernaut had already carved rivers of suffering across Poland and Western Europe. Soviet boots had trampled into Lithuania's heart, but in the steely rooms of foreign embassies, a different kind of battle was underway, a battle waged with documents, not bullets. Chiune Sugihara, Japan's vice-consul stationed in Kaunas, present-day Kaunas, walked quietly down the polished corridor of his modest office. He was a mild-mannered diplomat by trade, trained in Russian, steeped in negotiation, a man who understood the intricate dance of bureaucracy. Yet, in this corner of occupied Europe, Sugihara had found the scope of his duty stretching far beyond protocol. Subscribe so you won't miss new stories, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. Your interest inspires us to discover new topics. Refugees, haggard, hollow-eyed, clutching bundles of hope and fear, pressed against the tall iron gates of the Japanese consulate. Most had already survived harrowing journeys from Poland, where Nazi tanks had carved a path of fire and death. Their only hope lay in escape, if they could somehow reach the safety of Japan, or further on to the Dutch Caribbean colonies, and away from Nazi reach. But to get there, they needed precious Japanese transit visas, official papers that would allow passage through the Soviet Union to Vladivostok, then by sea to Japan. Sugihara glanced out the window at the line growing longer each day. He had already received frantic petitions from Jewish leaders and families, imploring him to help. Yet Tokyo had sent a firm directive: only those who satisfied strict immigration guidelines and possessed the correct documents should receive visas. The rules were clear, and coldly indifferent to the desperate realities outside. On July 29th, Sugihara met with Jewish representatives, entrepreneurs, teachers, mothers, rabbis, who explained the dire situation. Only a tiny handful could meet the formal requirements, yet thousands faced annihilation if forced to remain. The urgency shone in their eyes, echoed in their trembling voices. For Sugihara, the moment posed a choice, a crossroads between obedience to authority and obedience to conscience. Night settled in around the consulate, heavy with impossible decisions. Sugihara sat at his desk, wrestling with the weight of bureaucratic rigidity against the moral imperative pounding in his heart. He drafted a telegram to Tokyo, requesting permission to issue visas en masse. The reply, received the next morning, was swift and merciless: no. Yet, as the calendar flipped to July 31st, 1940, Sugihara picked up his pen. Worlds would soon change with strokes of ink. The pen becomes a lifeline. July 31st, 1940 dawned with Sugihara resolute. The line outside his window had grown to a sea of humanity. Among them were men like Zayev Levin, a mathematics professor, Rachel Krinsky, a seamstress who'd walked for days, and families with children whose futures flickered uncertainly. Sugihara's heart turned over at their stories, the litany of lost homes and fears of Nazi advance. Despite repeated instructions from Tokyo, Sugihara summoned his staff. "We will begin issuing visas. As many as need them." His wife, Yukiko Sugihara, an ever-present force, supported his decision, and together they prepared for the marathon task ahead. Under Sugihara's direction, the consulate transformed into a feverish workshop. Sugihara, Yukiko, and his staff worked hour after hour, day after day, handwriting Japanese transit visas by the hundreds. Each was meticulously filled out: name, birth date, nationality, final destination, the Dutch Caribbean colonies like Curaçao or Suriname, where official entry didn't require advanced permission, a loophole Sugihara seized. With every stamped document, a barrier weakened. Word spread through Kaunas and beyond: the Japanese consulate was granting passage to freedom. The lines thickened and spilled into the streets, crowded with people clutching hope and worn identification papers, more than 300 daily, an endless tide against ominous odds. The clock ticked with chilling precision. On August 3rd, a deadline loomed: diplomatic relations between Japan and the newly Soviet-occupied Lithuania would soon end, the consulate set to close in mere days. Under constant Soviet watch, with pressure mounting from his own government to cease unauthorized activity, Sugihara pressed on, fingers cramped, eyes bleary, mind focused with almost spiritual intensity. Outside, rumors of Gestapo advances shivered through the crowds. Kaunas was no longer safe. The world seemed to be collapsing ever inward, each border shutting tight behind German invaders. Yet within that embassy, Sugihara continued, every signature an act of defiance against annihilation. For many families, the moment a visa was placed into their hands marked the first true breath of freedom they'd taken since the war began. Conversations in Yiddish, Polish, Russian, and Hebrew hummed like prayers in the waiting room. Sugihara himself, gentle in demeanor yet relentless in resolve, was becoming a lifeline more tangible than any pipeline or safe house on the continent. When the deadline finally arrived, August 28, 1940, Sugihara's consulate was sealed. Yet even as the Soviets prepared to escort him out, the diplomat continued writing visas on the steps of his train as it waited at the station, passing documents through windows to those who had risked everything to be there. In total, Chiune Sugihara produced over 2,100 visas, facilitating the escape of approximately 6,000 men, women, and children. Flight through the Iron Curtain. With visas in hand, families hurried to board Soviet trains heading eastward, from Kaunas to Moscow, then onward to Vladivostok. The journey that awaited them was an odyssey fraught with peril. Soviet authorities, suspicious of foreigners, demanded bribes and papers at every turn. Japanese consular officials in Moscow, often perplexed by the flood of refugees, found themselves part of a living tidal wave set in motion by Sugihara's determination. On board cramped railcars, survivors clung to each other and their precious documents. It was a journey of hope buffered by constant fear, fear of being turned back, fear of Nazi agents lurking along the way, fear of starvation in vast, unfamiliar territories. Yet the news of Sugihara's actions had spread like wildfire, infusing fellow travelers with faith that somewhere beyond the horizon, safety awaited. For many, the next stop was Vladivostok. Here, Japanese ships awaited, ready to carry those with valid visas to Kobe, a city that would, for a brief moment, become a haven for escapees. Jewish aid agencies and local communities mobilized, providing shelter, sustenance, and support. Sugihara's signature proved their lifeline. In the face of looming war, a single piece of paper rendered meaningless by most became, for thousands, a ticket to survival. The family's onward voyage often led first to Japan, then to the Dutch Caribbean colonies, Curaçao and Suriname, which appeared as unlikely sanctuaries on official documentation. Though most would never set foot on those islands, host nations rarely turned away refugees once they arrived in Japan. Sugihara's careful wording had circumvented layers of bureaucracy and closed doors. While the refugees found shelter, other consulates caught wind of Sugihara's actions. Some, moved by what they saw, followed suit within their own limited capacities, issuing documents or providing assistance. Sugihara's blueprint became a quiet, subversive model in a world gripped by official apathy. Inside diplomatic circles, alarm bells sounded. Tokyo summoned Sugihara home, where the consequences of defiance began to rumble ominously. Yet the wheels set in motion proved unstoppable. Sugihara's transit visas rippled outward across continents, reshaping destinies and histories alike. Backlash and aftermath. Sugihara returned to Tokyo in October 1940, unsure of what fate awaited him. Within the corridors of Japanese bureaucracy, his actions had triggered uncomfortable reverberations. A country allied, reluctantly but firmly, with Nazi Germany, could ill afford to be seen as facilitating escapes for Jews. Investigations and reprimands shadowed Sugihara. He was frequently shuffled between posts, Berlin, Prague, Bucharest, his career quietly stunted. During the war, Sugihara's defiant act faded into obscurity, drowned out by global chaos. He struggled to support his family during the post-war years, at times living on the edge of poverty, his heroic deeds unacknowledged by the government he'd served. But for the refugees, a new life was unfolding. Those who'd made it to Japan eventually spread out across the world, settling in the USA, Israel, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Letters of gratitude and remembrance drifted back across continents. Children born in safety bore the names of Sugihara, a living tribute to the man whose pen had reshaped their fate. In 1968, one survivor managed to track down Sugihara, contacting him directly. The demand for recognition grew, urging authorities to honor what he'd done. By the late 20th century, Sugihara's name began to resurface in Israel, the United States, and even Japan. Jewish organizations led the way in telling his story, organizing meetings, awards, and planting trees in his honor. In 1985, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, granted Sugihara the title Righteous Among the Nations, an honor reserved for non-Jews who risked everything to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. Though frail, Sugihara traveled to Jerusalem to accept the award, finally meeting families and generations who owed their existence to his courage. Legacy written in ink. Chiune Sugihara spent his twilight years watching ripples from his courageous decision reshape reality. Thousands of descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, grew up safe, thriving, building new worlds. Numerous academic histories, documentaries, and novels arose, tracing the improbable network of refugees who owed their existence to a single diplomat's pen. In Kaunas, memorials now stand at the site of Sugihara's former consulate. The city honors him with a museum and annual commemorations, drawing visitors from all nations to walk the path he once walked, standing at the window where hope was handed out one signature at a time. In Japan, recognition came slowly but surely. After years of silence, a new generation embraced Sugihara as a model of moral courage, a figure who chose humanity over obedience. His own children carry on his message, visiting schools and embassies around the world, telling the story of a man who, in the cruelest of times, chose not only to survive, but to save. To this day, survivors gather with the Sugihara family, sharing stories, photographs, and memories. Each piece of Sugihara's legacy is living proof that, against the machine of war and bureaucracy, a single individual, armed with conscience and conviction, can alter the fate of thousands. The visa that let someone escape, the hope extended through a window, the ink that saved generations, each stands as a monument not just to Sugihara, but to the fragile, defiant strength of humanity itself. Courage in the shadow of the rising sun. As the Sugihara family adjusted to Tokyo's post-war realities, life was not easy. Chiune, once a respected diplomat, sank into relative obscurity after his dismissal from the Foreign Service in 1947. His career options in a devastated Japan were limited by the political stigma of his insubordination. The same government that once demanded obedience now ignored him, as the Allied occupation restructured the nation's very fabric. Unable to find diplomatic work, Chiune took odd jobs. At one point, he was a door-to-door light bulb salesman, far removed from the corridors of embassies and international intrigue. Yukiko, steadfast and uncomplaining, supported him, shielding their 3 sons from poverty as best she could. The Japanese economy lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Public transportation and basic infrastructure barely functioned. Stories of refugees, even those linked to Japanese courage, found little traction in a society focused on rebuilding from the ashes. Yet echoes of Sugihara's bravery resonated in far-flung corners. In the United States, Canada, and Israel, survivors rebuilt lives and communities. In Kobe, some who had arrived with trembling hands and Sugihara's precious papers became teachers, scientists, rabbis, pillars of new societies in the free world. Meanwhile, Japan's post-war narrative focused on the suffering experienced at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo, and the shame of a lost war. Acts of individual defiance during the conflict were seldom celebrated. For Sugihara and his family, the world seemed to have moved on, his name faded from the record books, his former colleagues silent, his government indifferent. Still, now and then, the Sugiharas received letters. They arrived in battered envelopes addressed in Polish or Russian, sometimes containing photographs of smiling children who, but for a signed visa, might never have existed. It was in these moments, between brief stints at translation jobs, tutoring, and the occasional diplomatic posting in Eastern Europe, that Sugihara felt the quiet satisfaction of having chosen the harder path, the road less traveled by diplomats and bureaucrats. Behind closed doors, the family sometimes recalled Kaunas. Yukiko would tell their sons, "Your father did what was right, no matter the risk." Unbeknownst to them, the seeds he'd sown continued to grow, hidden but waiting for the world to remember. A chain unbroken, the refugees' journey continues. While Sugihara quietly endured post-war Japan, the web of those he saved stretched across the world, as vibrant and complex as any living organism. In Israel, entire communities remembered the visas for life that had made their very existence possible. Historians traced the fragmented exodus that had begun in Kaunas rail stations and Japanese steamer ships. The journey of the Sugihara survivors, as they came to be known, rarely ended in Japan. Most refugees spent only a brief, uncertain sojourn amid Kobe's bustling port. From there, many secured onward passage to Shanghai, itself a city swollen with escaping Jews and other European refugees. In the so-called Shanghai ghetto, Jewish life flourished despite hardships, blending Ashkenazi religious traditions with the kaleidoscopic culture of pre-war China. Others, with help from global Jewish relief agencies like the American Joint Distribution Committee, managed to reach Australia, Canada, the United States, and Palestine, later Israel. Each bore stories of horror averted, of chance, and of the man who had risked his livelihood for strangers. Their children inherited languages, Japanese words and phrases, Russian lullabies, smatterings of Polish and German, passed down like heirlooms. In haunting memoirs and oral histories, Sugihara's name became synonymous with deliverance. For some, the journey had been harrowing. Soviet guards bullied and extorted, Japanese authorities sometimes hesitated or misunderstood. Arriving in foreign ports, refugees faced new struggles, rebuilding homes, learning new tongues, and mourning relatives swallowed up by the Holocaust. Yet always, the thread ran back to that office in Kaunas, to the frantic ink and the signature of Chiune Sugihara. In synagogues in Tel Aviv, Chicago, and Montreal, prayers of gratitude echoed for the man most had never seen since that desperate summer of 1940. His legacy, invisible in government records, grew in the stories told at dinner tables and the names given to baby boys and girls, a living testament that the defiant act of one could ripple through generations. Recognition across oceans. The decades rolled forward. The Cold War chilled diplomacy, and Europe rebuilt atop the graves of its murdered millions. For Sugihara, retirement was a life of quiet labor. He translated for Japanese trading companies working with Soviet Russia, a skill set honed years before in Manchuria and Kaunas. Unbeknownst to him, however, wheels were turning in distant places. In 1968, a Jewish survivor named Joshua Nishri, now an Israeli diplomat, embarked on a personal quest. After years of searching, Nishri tracked down Sugihara, then living modestly in Fujisawa, southwest of Tokyo. The reunion was emotional and cathartic. Nishri brought photos, warm embraces, and heartfelt gratitude on behalf of thousands. He pressed Sugihara to tell his story, and to allow the world to finally recognize his heroism. Word spread among Jewish communities. Articles appeared in Yiddish and Hebrew newspapers. Invitations arrived from descendants eager to meet him. In 1985, after a thorough review, Yad Vashem formally invited Sugihara and his family to Israel for a ceremony bestowing the title Righteous among the nations. Only a handful of Japanese citizens would ever earn this distinction. Sugihara, frail but dignified, stepped onto Israeli soil that year. Hundreds gathered at Ben Gurion Airport, men and women who, with their children and grandchildren, owed their lives to his act. At Yad Vashem, he crouched to plant a tree along the Avenue of the Righteous, among other legendary names like Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg. At the ceremony, survivors wept openly, embracing him as one of their own. The press asked, "Why did you do it, when it risked your family and career?" Sugihara replied simply, "If you see someone in distress, you must help. You cannot just leave them." His wife and son stood beside him, honored at last for suffering in silence while the world caught up with their story. A name restored. Recognition in Israel and among Jewish communities soon reverberated back to Japan. News magazines and television programs, eager for stories of hope amid the war's darkness, began to trace Sugihara's long-forgotten heroism. A new generation of Japanese, post-war citizens searching for models of ethical courage not tainted by empire, embraced his legacy. In the foreign ministry, officials quietly admitted the past wrong. Whereas Sugihara's name had once been erased from rosters and evaluations, now it appeared in textbooks as an exemplar of giri and ninjo, duty and compassion. Diplomats trained in the new Japanese service read his case as a lesson in moral fortitude. For the Sugihara family, the spotlight was surprising but welcome. Letters arrived daily, from Argentina to Australia, from families tracing their origins to a transit visa hastily scrawled in 1940. Invitations came for lectures at universities and for visits to consulates worldwide. Yukiko and her sons traveled, telling their side, the cost imposed by one man's moral courage and the pride they now felt. In 1991, a year after his death, the city of Yatsu, Sugihara's birthplace, unveiled a permanent memorial. His childhood home was preserved, and foreign delegations came to pay their respects. In Kaunas, Lithuania, the White House on Suvorov Street where hope had poured out in signature after signature became the Sugihara House Museum. Japanese tourists, Jewish pilgrims, and international schoolchildren arrived to walk its shadowed corridors and touch the desk where worlds had been saved. Perhaps most poignant, in diplomatic circles worldwide, Sugihara was no longer a cautionary tale, but a legend, a man whose pen moved more history than any sword. The ripple through history. The ripple of Sugihara's deeds continues to spread outward. By the dawn of the 21st century, researchers estimated that direct descendants of those who received his visas numbered over 100,000, each one proof that heroism need not be bombastic, that compassion can bend the flow of eras. Among the branches of the Sugihara family tree, physicians, musicians, inventors, writers, and even future diplomats carry his story forward. At international symposiums, Holocaust museums, and schools from Jerusalem to New York to Tokyo, the tale of that long Lithuanian summer is told and retold like a modern legend. In Japan, the government now honors Sugihara annually, a far cry from the silence that greeted his post-war years. At the Kaunas consulate-turned-museum, a careful recreation of the tiny office displays his battered inkwell, his glasses, reference dictionaries, and a replica of the rubber stamps he wielded like lifelines. Schoolchildren file through, wide-eyed and reverent, learning that the power of a single moral act radiates through time and space. Literature, theater, and cinema have discovered Chiune Sugihara. Novels and biographies proliferate, documentaries win awards. Survivors pen memoirs recounting what it was to stand in that line, clutching children and praying for the ink to dry. Above all, Sugihara's act becomes a parable, a counterpoint to the machinery of genocide. Where bureaucracy and racism met, one man, moved by conscience, opened a door, then held it open as long as he could. The message is universal: authority cannot erase the individual's duty to do good. In a world often cast in shades of gray, Chun and Yukiko Sugihara stand as lighthouses, living proof that compassion trumps calculation, that every signature counts, and that true legacy is written not in power, but in the lives you save. The survivors, rebuilding amid remembrance. The urban centers where Sugihara's refugees landed, Kobe, Shanghai, Sydney, San Francisco, Montreal, became crucibles for new beginnings. The insistent hum of rebuilding was tempered by trauma. In the narrow quarters of Shanghai's Hongkou district, Jewish families coming from Europe via Sugihara's visas faced cramped conditions, rationed food, and frequent outbreaks of disease. Yet within this unlikely enclave, synagogues, schools, and bakeries sprang to life. In Kobe, the Jewish community, bolstered by new arrivals from Poland and Lithuania, built networks of support aided by local merchants and the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Japanese authorities watched warily, fearful of upsetting their allies in Berlin, but ultimately allowed the refugees to stay, recognizing the humanitarian crisis without fully grasping its scope. Each family possessed tales of miraculous escape, of hurried packing in Kaunas, of moments staring down Soviet border guards with trembling hands, of arrival in places so foreign that even the air felt different. Survivors gathered in little groups, swapping stories about Sugihara. Some had spent hours in line, others mere minutes, but all remembered the diplomat's kindness, the soft murmur of his voice, and the urgency as he stamped document after document. The world outside remained turbulent. In early 1941, Japan expanded its empire into Southeast Asia and later clashed with Allied forces as the Pacific War began in December. The refugees, ever transient, found themselves scattered by the changing tides, forced once again to adapt to new lands, Australia, the United States, Canada, sometimes with nothing more than the Sugihara visa tucked into a battered suitcase. Memory kept the stories alive. Across continents, Shabbat candles flickered in homes founded by Sugihara's courage. The names of the man and wife who had taken a stand against bureaucratic indifference were whispered in prayer, reminders, amid loss, that even the direst circumstances could birth hope. The children, inheritors of hope. By the 1950s and 1960s, Sugihara's children, the direct descendants of those rescued, were growing up in freedom. Teachers, doctors, engineers, and artists came to identify as Sugihara Jews, a term coined within the Israeli and global diaspora. Kibbutzim in Israel were home to boys and girls proudly displaying their Lithuanian roots and carrying worn photographs of desperate families saved by one man's resolve. Some became leaders in Holocaust education, ensuring the world would neither forget Sugihara's heroism nor the bureaucratic apathy that had nearly doomed them. At synagogues in Jerusalem and New York, annual ceremonies retold the miracle of the visas. Young people who had never met the man described him as an ancestral benefactor, invoking his name alongside biblical figures. The stories multiplied, tales of close calls at Soviet checkpoints, of relatives who had not received visas and vanished into history, of chance meetings with kind strangers and terrifying encounters with hostile officials. Each narrative centered on Sugihara's desk, a focal point for the collision of fate and compassion. In school projects and speeches, Sugihara's legacy became a clarion call, the power of one. The red stamp now symbolized not Japanese bureaucracy, but hope and agency. Though many survivors lost parents, siblings, and homes, they raised their children to remember, passing on the gratitude and burden of memory for generations. The family trees grew. In the 1970s, researchers began to map the impact of Sugihara's decision, tracing lines of descent that wound from the dark corners of war to the bright halls of universities, medical centers, and parliament buildings. Each branch a living monument to a man and woman who had held open the gates of deliverance. Recognition in modern Japan, a slow awakening. Japan's reckoning with its wartime past was slow and often reluctant. For decades, the focus remained on atomic devastation and economic rebirth. Sugihara's actions, at odds with pre-war policy, were not immediately celebrated. But by the 1980s and 1990s, a more nuanced national dialogue began to emerge. Scholars published articles challenging the notion that Japan's war was only a tragedy, showcasing individuals like Sugihara who had risked ostracism for moral reasons. High school textbooks included his story as a rare beacon amid a landscape of regret. University seminars debated the meaning of civil courage, and foreign ministry officials quietly cited Sugihara when discussing ethics and diplomacy. The Japanese government moved cautiously but decisively. In 2000, a commemorative postage stamp was issued featuring Sugihara's portrait and the visas for life. Museums in Tokyo staged traveling exhibitions reconstructing the events in Kaunas with authentic documents, photographs, and survivor testimony. Yukiko Sugihara, now elderly, appeared at these events, her presence a gentle reminder that true heroism was often born within the family. Public reaction shifted. Sugihara became a touchstone for discussions around conscience, international law, and remembrance. Television dramas and children's books ensured his name would echo long after the last survivor had passed. His old alma mater, Waseda University, established an endowed chair in his honor, while civic groups in Yatsu, his birthplace, organized annual marches inviting diplomats, teachers, and students to walk in remembrance. The circle closed. A nation once reticent now honored the quiet man whose rebellion against authority had redefined its history. Ripples in international diplomacy. Sugihara's legacy radiated into the wider world, influencing not just survivors but the very craft of diplomacy. At conferences on human rights, his story was often cited as a Sugihara test, a scenario for diplomats facing moral challenges. In Israel, new generations of diplomats studying at the foreign ministry learn about Sugihara's choices as foundational ethics. Holocaust museums worldwide feature his image and a reproduction of a Kovna visa as lessons in courage under oppression. Humanitarian organizations invoke his name when urging states to accept refugees fleeing modern ethnic and religious persecution. Even Japanese diplomats posted to embassies and missions around the world are instructed in the Sugihara example, the imperative to balance national policy with the dictates of conscience. In Lithuania, the Sugihara House Museum hosts annual international seminars encouraging cultural and diplomatic exchange, inviting students of all backgrounds to reflect on the meaning of civil courage. The symbolic power of the visa for life has become universal, invoked by activists and governments alike. Scholars trace the resonance of Sugihara's actions through later humanitarian crises in Kosovo, Rwanda, Syria, demonstrating how one man's story can become a global yardstick for ethical action. A living monument, remembrance, and responsibility. As the 21st century advances, the world's memory of the Holocaust faces challenges of time and generational distance. But the monument to Sugihara grows ever more alive. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, thousands gather in Lithuania, Israel, Japan, and the United States to recall not just the victims but the rescuers, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Descendants of Sugihara's saved families, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, garden, teach, invent, write, and inspire, all in the name of their inherited freedom. Each year, new names are added to lists of survivors' descendants, each bearing testimony to Sugihara's impact. The Sugihara House Museum in Kaunas, now a UNESCO-listed heritage site, welcomes visitors from every continent. Here, survivors' stories are told in a dozen languages. Schools bring children to see not only history but the blueprint for action in times of moral crisis. Sugihara's surviving family participate in commemorations, speaking not just of heroism but the quiet costs, the years of poverty, isolation, and struggle that followed his defiance. Their message is clear: remembrance carries responsibility. Conscience, even when outnumbered by power, is a weapon as strong as any army. And so, across the planet, the story of Chiune Sugihara, his ink-stained hand, his sleepless nights in Kaunas, his belief that one must help the stranger, continues to inspire. Against bureaucracy, against silence, against fear, the monument stands, a living legacy of compassion, a beacon for all who ask what one person can do. Journeys of return. The 21st century brought a new phenomenon: descendants of Sugihara's refugees, children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, undertaking journeys to retrace the footsteps of survival. They traveled across continents, from Tel Aviv or Brooklyn or Melbourne, all the way to Lithuania, Japan, and the routes through Russia and Manchuria that their families once traversed in terror and hope. In Kaunas, young adults stood in the courtyard of the Sugihara house, reverently studying the lists of names, the yellowed copies of transit visas, and the faded group photographs of desperate families. Many wept quietly. Here was the small, sunlit office where their futures began, where their very existence was negotiated against the faceless machinery of genocide. In Vilnius, visitors lit candles at the sites of former synagogues and ghettos. In Vladivostok, they stood on battered piers where Sugihara's refugees had boarded ships to Japan. Some families insisted on visiting tiny towns in Poland or Belarus where surnames began, piecing together the jagged lines of lost heritage. The emotional climax often came when descendants visited Yatsu, Sugihara's birthplace nestled among green Japanese hills. Local schoolchildren welcomed the pilgrims with paper cranes and hand-painted banners. "Thank you, Sugihara-san." The visitors, often bringing with them stories of hardship and achievement, found deep kinship with the villagers who had so long ago given the world this quiet, principled man. These birthright journeys were transformative, forging connections across cultures and continents. In moments of silent awe, standing where history hung heavy, visitors understood that their lives were not inevitable, they were acts of deliverance, contingent on the courage of a stranger who chose to help. Memory in the classroom and the diaspora. In schoolrooms from Osaka to Toronto to Jerusalem, Sugihara's story came alive as a lesson for modern times. Educators found in his legacy a universal parable about moral decision-making, the dangers of blind obedience, and the sacredness of every human life. Textbooks devoted to World War II were no longer solely focused on battles and dates. They now contained the quiet, revolutionary acts that shifted the course of history. Jewish communities, now deeply rooted in places like New York and Haifa, mark each year not only Passover and Yom HaShoah but Sugihara Day, a celebration of rescue and a call for courage. In animated storytelling sessions, children listened, rapt, as a teacher unfurled the tale of the diplomat who wrote for days, refusing food or sleep, his wife massaging his cramped hands so he could sign a few more life-saving documents. Japanese students, learning about their country's manifold wartime roles, faced questions of national conscience. Sugihara was not just a hero, he was a challenge. Would I have done this? Could I? Class debates about ethics, disobedience, and the true purpose of diplomacy became animated and sometimes heated. The Sugihara example pressed students to wrestle with the responsibilities attached to privilege and authority. International Holocaust remembrance efforts, too, adopted Sugihara's example. Youth groups, scout troops, and interfaith delegations reconstructed the journey of the refugees, even staging yearly reenactments at the preserved consulate in Kaunas. Survivors, now elders, visited classrooms in person or by video, their testimonies lending flesh and voice to what might otherwise have become distant history. Modern humanitarianism and the shadow of Sugihara. As new crises haunted the 21st century, genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and Syria, the example of Chiune Sugihara was invoked at the United Nations and among grassroots human rights organizations. Journalists, activists, and diplomats cited his legacy during refugee summits, arguing that the moral clarity displayed in Kaunas, 1940, was no less necessary today. A generation of Sugihara scholars emerged, trained in law, policy, and ethics. They traveled to flashpoints around the world, seeking to document acts of courageous dissent, border guards quietly passing families to safety, officials forging papers, ordinary citizens sheltering the hunted. Institutions such as Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum distributed Sugihara's story in visiting exhibitions to countries sometimes grappling with their own histories of complicity and rescue. At memorial services and on social media, the phrase "visa for life" became a rallying symbol, a promise that humanity must always present an alternative to persecution. Conferences were organized under Sugihara's name, focusing on how individuals could resist dehumanizing systems, and how governments could and must enshrine moral dissent as not merely permissible, but essential. The world, for all its progress, still confronted the challenges Sugihara had known: mountains of paperwork, institutional inertia, officials facing impossible choices. Yet everywhere his story was told, it insisted that even in the darkest bureaucratic labyrinth, there was room for human decency. A family's pilgrimage, bearing the torch. The Sugihara family, for years bearing the scars of ostracism and hardship, has become both caretakers and standard-bearers for this legacy. Yukiko, until her death in 2008, traveled widely to speak, meeting not only dignitaries but children and grandchildren of those she and Chun had helped. Their sons, Hiroki, Chiaki, and Haruki, continued that pilgrimage. On anniversaries in Kaunas or Yatsu, at conferences in Jerusalem or Vienna, the Sugihara children stood before crowds, narrating not so much triumph as testament. They spoke openly about the cost, the loss of career, the years of obscurity, the slow and sometimes painful journey to posthumous recognition. Their message: history's moral giants were first ordinary parents, husbands, and wives who dared, in a moment, to do what was right. They joined with descendants of rescued families in new rituals of remembrance, lighting candles, planting cherry trees, reciting the names of lost ancestors and lost worlds. In these moments, the Sugihara name was no longer simply a part of Japanese or Jewish history, but had become woven into the global tapestry of human rights and moral action. Through their presence, the Sugihara family reminded new generations that heroism is not the preserve of the famous, but the inheritance of anyone willing to say yes in the face of cruelty and indifference. The pen and the promise. Now, in the bright light of the third millennium, Chiune Sugihara's pen, a battered, ordinary instrument now encased at Yad Vashem and in the Sugihara house, has become an emblem cherished by all those who still hope in goodness. Each year, its image is projected on screens at educational conferences, carried on banners in peaceful marches, and recreated in miniature for children as a toy, a symbol of conscience in action. The Sugihara promise is now invoked across borders, a vow to put empathy above expedience, to see beyond bureaucratic restraints, to remember that every choice matters. From legislators considering asylum policies, to high schoolers debating ethics, to families lighting candles in distant cities, the challenge endures: what story will your signature write? Personal stories still emerge, of a doctor in Canada whose grandmother escaped Kaunas in 1940, of a Dutch composer whose parents met in the Shanghai ghetto after being handed Sugihara visas, of a Japanese lawyer, inspired by the Kaunas story, who became an advocate for stateless refugees. These stories flow backward, connecting the present to that summer of crisis and resolve on a quiet Lithuanian street, and forward, reminding every generation that humanity's future, like its past, is shaped in moments where the heart overrules the rules. In the darkest hours, the pen remains mighty. And as long as the line of memory holds, and as long as the world believes in the power of a single compassionate act, the legacy of Chiune Sugihara, his ink, his courage, his promise, will never fade.